Thanks to everybody for coming out. My name's Kodwo Eshun. I'm one part of the Otolith Group. And sitting there is Anjalika Sagar of the Otolith Group, next to Annie Fletcher, once of Van Abbey and now of the Irish Museum of Modern Art, the new director. Thanks to everybody for coming out on a Sunday morning. We appreciate it very much. We're going to begin. Could you please lower the lights? Thank you.
I want to say a few words about the music. Number one is, there are 3 pieces on the program. The first is called Evil Nigger, and the second is called Gay Guerrilla, and the third is called Crazy Nigger. Now these 3 pieces that can be played by any number of instruments. The reason I have them for pianos here is for a practical reason. One can play this piece, therefore, with just 4 people and then 4 pianos. But if melody instruments were playing, probably a good number would be somewhere in the area of maybe 10 instruments, 10 to 18 instruments, usually on the same family. So therefore, another version could be for, let's say, 18 stringed instruments. These particular pieces, formally, are an attempt to what I call make organic music. That is to say, the third part of any part, or the third measure, or the third section, the third part has to contain all of the information of the first 2 parts, and then go on from there. So therefore, unlike romantic music or classical music, where you actually have different sections, and you have these sections, which, for instance, are in great contrast to the first section or some other section in the piece. These pieces, they're not exactly perfect. They're not perfect. But there's an attempt to make every section contain all of the information of the previous sections, or else taking out information at a gradual and logical rate. Now, there was a little problem with the titles of the piece. There were some students and one faculty member who felt that the titles were somehow derogatory in some manner, being that the word nigger is in it. These particular titles, the reason I use them is because, in fact, there's a whole series of these pieces, and they can be called a nigger series. Now, the reason I use that particular word is because, for me, it is what I call a basicness about it. That is to say, I feel in any case, the first niggers were, of course, field niggers. And upon that is really the basis of what I call the American economic system. Without field niggers, you wouldn't really have such a great and grand economy that we have. So that is what I call the first and great nigger, field niggers. And what I mean by niggers is that thing which is fundamental, that person or thing that attains to a basicness, a fundamentalness, and eschews that thing which is superficial, or can we say elegant. So that a nigger, for me, is that kind of thing which attains himself or herself to the ground of anything, you see. And that's what I mean by nigger. So there are many niggers. There are many kinds of niggers. There are, of course, 99 names of Allah, but then there are 52 niggers. And so therefore, we are playing two of those niggers. Now, the reason I use Gay Guerrilla, Guerrilla, that one, is because these names, let me put a little subsystem here. These names, either I glorify them or they glorify me. And in the case of guerrilla, that glorifies gay. That's to say, there aren't that many gay guerrillas. I don't feel that gaydom does have that strength, so therefore, I use that word in hopes that they will. You see, at this point, I don't feel that gay guerrillas can really match with Afghani guerrillas or PLO guerrillas, but let us hope in the future that they might. You see, that's why I use that word, guerrilla. It means a guerrilla is someone who is, in any case, sacrificing his life for a point of view. And you know, if there is a cause, and if it is a great cause, those who belong to that cause will sacrifice their blood, because without blood, there is no cause. So therefore, that is the reason I use gay guerrilla, in hopes that I might be one, if called upon to be one. Okay.
we're missing one half of the Otolith Group, but hopefully she'll... So for those of you who'd like to see the full film, it's on at the Stedelijk, and I think it's only just for one more day. We're going to start with a few questions, and then we will open out for questions from the audience. First of all, so in the Sonic Acts Festival Guide, Julius Eastman is described as an Afrofuturist artist, a genius composer, and minimalist musician. How would you agree with those descriptions, and how would you describe Eastman's work? And how do you understand his legacy now? I don't know which one of you wants to start. Anjali.
You know, I think the role of the African-American new music composer in the 20th century always arrives to us as a kind of anomaly. We're used to African-American composers in the worlds of jazz, R&B, soul, rock music, folk music, but composition, there always seems to be what Fred Moten calls a kind of an oxymoron at the stake, at the heart of African-American composition. So we might be able to name certain names, such as Anthony Davis, or Donald Fox, or Julia Perry, or Terry Adkins, or Benjamin Patterson, but they are always somehow not at the center of the culture. They seem to be exceptions to the rule. And Eastman in some way falls into this category, but in some way he's an exception even to these exceptions. I think the terms Afrofuturism, the terms of genius, the terms of minimal composer, they kind of reach towards what Eastman represents, but they don't really capture the kind of the uniquely disruptive capacity that Eastman brought to questions of new music, to the coherence of what we think of as the Euro-American avant-garde, and to what we think of as African-American music. He has this kind of, this transgressive quality. He was both a consummate insider and at the same time a kind of outsider. Maybe Leroy Jones's 1964 poem Black Dada Nihilismus, that conveys an aspect of Eastman's role, that he was both a consummate virtuosic figure. He was a composer, a vocalist, a pianist, an organist, a composer, leader of his own ensembles. At the same time, he was always somehow cutting across any of those categories. So I think, yeah, they begin to touch on Eastman's role, but they don't really capture part of the why Eastman, I think, has captured so many people's imagination at this moment in time.
Yes, I mean, it's difficult to talk, I mean, the term Afrofuturism is extremely complex. So, I mean, I don't see Eastman as a Afrofuturist as such. I think I see him as somebody who kept turning the expectations around and around and around, like the expectations of him as a composer. I mean, there's multiple gazes on him that also includes kind of like a kind of black conservative gaze as well, in a way. But there was this sense that he was constantly turning this. I mean, you can see that in the introduction that he gives, you know. The fact that he kind of politicizes his blackness is very interesting in relation to the new music scene, which was fine as long as he was composing and just composing. But bringing blackness into it was, isolated him in many ways. And he was, and therefore, what does he do with that isolation? He turns it even more. He queers it even more. He keeps, and for me, that is the most interesting aspect of Julius Eastman's work, is this, and then, and I think in the kind of sense that he was always composing not just in terms of writing music, but also in terms of writing text.
Can you talk, Anjali, a bit about why this work resonates for you both now? And you made the film in 2017, so how does it speak to that moment and to the now, to the present?
I mean, at the time, our good friend Mark Fisher had committed suicide and died. And basically, I think making this work was like a eulogy to him, in a way. But also, there was this sense that, again, like in the introduction that Eastman gives, there was something in it that was prescient then and is prescient now, that continues to be important in relation to the militancy of his of the speech, but also then of the music. I mean, the new music scene is extremely complex for black musicians and composers to be part of. It's a very exclusive scene and always has been. And I know that because I was working in the world of presenting experimental music in London and working as a musician for many years. So I mean, it's very interesting to have gone through that and then to be faced with Eastman and his life, and being able to make this work around his work as such. And to, I think also the challenge of how to make visual his music was just a challenge for us that we wanted to explore.
So Julius Eastman died in 1990. You know, he died homeless in New York. And maybe it wasn't until about 2007 when one of his colleagues and friends, a composer called Mary Jane Leach, she assembled all of the existing tape recordings of his music and released an album called Unjust Malaise, which is a beautiful anagram of Julius Eastman. So during his life, despite composing a lot of work and appearing in a lot of ensembles, there was no album of his own music. So it's only in 2007 that I heard his music in detail. So Unjust Malaise is on YouTube. You can hear it. You can buy the CD, the triple CD. And so his music immediately haunted me. I mean, I just thought it was incredible. I couldn't believe it. I also couldn't believe that I'd never heard his music. I thought I knew about new music. I thought I knew about so-called minimalism, and I just never heard anything like that. And I was kind of angry, actually outraged, and also scared that that compositions that were so intense and so joyous and such a kind of ecstatic intensity could just disappear. It was kind of horrifying to me, and it is horrifying. And in a way, we were always thinking about how to respond to that work. But it took a long time to work out a way of approaching it. I think I was intimidated by the forcefulness of his music. If you listen to this composition or The Holy Presence of Joan of Arc for 10 cellos, it's just phenomenal. It just comes roaring out. I think of this music as horses riding over your head. Just imagine a fleet of horses galloping towards you, and they just don't stop. They ride right over you, and then as they ride over you, stand up and start cheering. That's part of what Eastman makes me feel, mixed with this horror. So in a way, the horror of Mark Fisher's death and the horror of Trump's election and the accumulating horror of African-American male and female deaths at the hands of police, all of that, in a way, created a feeling of anger, like just continuous anger. And the idea of a work that could respond to that work, respond to those feelings, respond to those events, the continuous drumbeat of death. In a way, at a certain point, we realized that maybe an Eastman composition would be a way to do that. So to me, Eastman's music now speaks to the kind of what people call the afterlife of slavery. It speaks to that moment that we're in which the violence visited on African American and Hispanic, queer people of color, that violence is not contingent and accidental, it's structural and in some way functional to the system. That kind of permanent exposure to violence and to death, Eastman's militancy spoke to that. So we started thinking of Eastman's as its own protest music, not hip hop, not grime, but its own form of music. And so the more we thought about it, the more we thought we had to engage with it. And so I think those are the reasons why Eastman's music just started mattering to us. It just became the matter at hand, a matter of life and death, actually.
Can you talk a bit about how the work is kind of structured and dramatized? Because it begins with, unfortunately for those who haven't seen the full work, they wouldn't know that there's speeches both at the beginning and at the end. So it'd be nice to hear about those speeches, how they function and how they relate to the performance in the middle.
I'll say a bit about that briefly. So at the beginning of the video, you see a poet and a researcher called Dante Michaud, and he gives a 6-minute speech. And at the end of the video, you see a performer and composer called Elaine Michener, and she gives the same speech in very different styles. And then in the middle, you see the 4 pianists, Rolf Hines, Zubin Kanga, Siwan Rees, and Eliza McCarthy. You see the 4 pianists who perform Eastman's 1978 composition, Evil Nigger, for 23 minutes. No, 27 minutes. It's a 23-minute composition, but they play it for 27 minutes because that's take 5 that you see. So, and the speech that Dante starts with and Elaine finishes with is a speech that Julius Eastman himself gave on 16th January 1980 in Northwestern University in Evanston outside Chicago. He was invited to present 3 of his compositions, the composition Evil Nigger that you hear here, the composition Crazy Nigger, which you do not hear, and the composition Gay Guerrilla that you don't hear. So there were 4 pianos on stage. Eastman is playing one of those pianos. And so there's been a controversy in the campus of Northwestern University, which at the time was a famously racist campus. And Eastman had put posters of the concerts around the campus, and some of the African-American students had complained because the inflammatory nature of the titles combined with the racist atmosphere on campus, and they were outraged by these titles. So there was a meeting, and Eastman agreed to take the posters down. So Eastman steps onto the stage, the Stedelijk Concert Hall on Northwestern University, and he gives this 6-minute speech in which he lays out his philosophy of music, and then he lays out his concepts of the titles, like why. So we understand that he has a kind of economic understanding of the term nigger, and he has a militant understanding of the term guerrilla. And these feed into a kind of, actually an unprecedented analysis of these terms. So this is 1980, it's before. Reagan has not yet come into power, but he clearly is on the rise. The Soviet Union have occupied Afghanistan. The Palestinian Liberation Organization are at war with the Israeli Defense Force. Thatcher has come into power in Britain. So what we now know as neoliberalism is resurgent. Popular authoritarianism is on the rise. And it's in this context that Eastman steps onto the stage and gives this 6-minute speech. And to absolute silence. People are like, what is this? He gives the speech, and then he sits down and then plays the performances. So inviting Dante and Elaine to speak those, it brings this element from the past, because the idea of our video is that, you know, when Eastman talks about the gay guerrillas, he's talking about the future. He says gaydom doesn't have the courage yet of Afghani guerrillas or PLO guerrillas, but he hopes that it will. And in a way, that the idea of the video is that the 4 pianists, they are the gay guerrillas from 37 years into Eastman's future. So the composition calls to the future, and we are in his future. And they have come not to Eastman, but to us, because we need courage. The idea is that we ourselves, that's to say you, that's to say us, that's to say spectators, listeners, audiences, we need courage and fortitude and perseverance for the struggles that we are in right now. So in a way, the idea is that they've come to train us in concentration and focus and a certain kind of intensity. And so this is the idea. They come from Eastman's future to speak to us. So we think, in a way, we think of the video as a kind of training film to bring us up to scratch for the wars that we have to fight.
Anjali, perhaps you can talk about how it was staged, like the aesthetic decisions, how you filmed it.
There's a poem by Eastman, which I'll just read quickly, called, he writes, "Light streams through the darkness, opening the caves. Light, sorrow. Light cannot shine where no light is. Truth is light and darkness. More light, more light, more light, more light. Light is not darkness." It's from Julius Eastman, notes in the score for the Moon's Silent Modulation from 1970. You know, one has to remember that Julius Eastman comes from an esoteric Christian background, like a liturgical background. So this sense of light has a, you know, kind of multiple meanings, like in terms of, you know, the idea of enlightenment as such, and, you know, and this idea of, you know, wanting to scramble out of the Platonic cave into the light. But there's also so for us, this sense of light and darkness, yeah, we wanted to, I suppose, highlight these ideas by making the darkness darker and making the lighter in the film. The sense that, so we used literally the kind of black surface, like my shoes, like the black shiny surface of the piano, and worked with this lighting rig that actually, the idea of it comes from another film that we made on Don Cherry and the Kodwo project, where we used this LED light system that would reflect onto the pianos, 2 baby grand pianos. This, in a way, created like a protective, invisible, not cage, but let's say an invisible aura, or a visible aura, like, of refracted light around the musicians and around Eastman's composition. What is not present in the fact that we have 2 people front-ending and back-ending the work. This also, for us, was protected, but what isn't present is the fact that more people can say those words. So I think what we wanted to almost do was kind of create like this stage, this all of these ideas, but through these camera angles in a way. So the camera angles capture all these different, as you can see, they capture all these different lines of light in a way, which I kind of think has a quite spiritual, futuristic, spiritual sense to it. And also, you know, when Edouard Glissant talks about opacity, opacity isn't a state of opaqueness. Opacity shines light back, shines a different light back. So I think, you know, to go to this idea of the structure of feeling, as Raymond William talks about it, a structure of feeling, I think this was very much what we were trying to create here, like to produce strange feelings, to produce a new state, a new sensibility around Eastman's work.
I'm going to bring Annie in here because there's an upcoming exhibition at Van Ab Museum called Xenogenesis. Is that right? Title?
That's right.
So, Annie, perhaps you want to say.
Sure. I mean, I just loved watching this again this morning. It's for all of those reasons, like this incredible feeling of the call to order, this incredible feeling of energy, of course, discipline, intensity, as you said. And we're going to end the whole exhibition. So it's an exhibition with 10 rooms with this work. And I think we did this really consciously, right? As that moment where you maybe are calling to order the Gay Guerrilla to come, or the evocation of new possibility. And this, I think, I mean, it to me, this piece, of course, brings to mind so much of what you're thinking about in relation to not only, you know, how he brilliantly enunciates the kind of racialized regimes of representation already and combats them or refuses them. And this kind of disruptive nature, I think, that is shot through the whole show in so many ways. It's going to be a show that I think Kodwo said so beautifully, it's not a survey, it's not a retrospective, we're calling it a cross-section, a kind of an exploration. What would it be if we put these things together? So I'm kind of very excited by the idea that that intense moment is what sort of throws you out of the exhibition at the end. And it will be a project that will pretty much look at the last, from 2011 to now. Very, again, what's so exciting about what Kodwo and Anjali are doing, I think, is this, that there's a sort of a refuting of this comprehensiveness of subjectivity. And the whole idea of xenogenesis, and again, I think you can both talk much more beautifully about it than I, but is an evocation from and the title of a trilogy from Octavia Butler. And it's really us trying to think about this idea of a generative alienation, a generative becoming something else. But something that, again, as we said, refuses the old regimes, refuses the toxicity of what we've already produced, and tries to search for something new. So I think on that level, it's this project is so evocative and exciting in relation to that.
I'm aware of time, so I'm thinking it might be good to see if there's any questions in the audience. I can't see very well. If not, I have more. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for a beautiful session and a beautiful sharing of beautiful material. I want to ask just basic sort of musicological questions, because I'm not at all familiar with new music personally. And I'm interested just to know what perhaps within the context of new music was particular in Julius Eastman's cadence or rhythm, or I don't know even what the terms are. I mean, the only thing that I sort of gained from watching this presentation was the sense in which the hands were kind of picked up like claws, like it sort of physiognomically did something to the players to kind of claw at the keyboard in this sort of strange way. So I'm just interested to hear more about what was particular about the music itself.
I think Dante and Elaine, I just recently had a conversation with them about this, and we were talking about we did a podcast with them actually, which is going to come out, but we were talking a lot about this Julius Eastman's compositions. I mean, I would suggest listening to as many as you can that are on Unjust Malaise. But I think he is a composer, right? So he's playing with time. He's working with time. He's also setting almost like a challenge to musicians, and because they're difficult pieces to play. And there is a sense that Eastman knows that there won't be that many black musicians, maybe that will be able to, that will be, not that they won't be able to, but there won't be many that will play his music. Some people said to us, for instance, why didn't you have African American or black British musicians playing this? And actually, it's not that pianists don't exist, but well, number one, it was hard to find 4 pianists that could all play this piece, and also who had been working together for enough time. So it would have meant finding some African American or black British pianists or black European pianists, and then putting together for a couple of years to play this, because that's how challenging it is. But I think the Eastman does set this challenge to musicians. Are you going to be able to play this piece? It's a physical test. I mean, these musicians are like gymnasts. They are like Olympic kind of gymnasts. I mean, they played this piece 6 to 7 times over 2 days, and it's a hard piece to play for 27. The composer, you can see, the hands are just like typewriter. They're almost typing, and they look like these biomorphic forms, like stabbing the piano. I mean, the militancy is there in the composition. You can hear it. It's horses, but it's also like, I don't know, it's also like hailstones, or again, there is something kind of like esoteric in the way the music is written. If you listen to the Holy Presence of Joan of Arc as well, you're listening to something that comes from beneath, definitely. Or from the cosmos.
I mean, I think you can't avoid a kind of allegory of the chromatic black keys and the diatonic white keys. You can't help but play out that stark opposition between chromatic and diatonic, between black and white. You can't help but transpose that into a racial allegory. And in a certain way, once we realized that we would work with these four pianists who are in the UK, they are the greatest living interpreters of Eastman's music. Zubin Kanga, he said maybe 23 people can play Eastman in the UK. Undoubtedly that's different in the US, but we were in the UK, specifically in London. So once you realize that, then in a way we decided to press into the ready-made racial allegory that the piano brings, and that allegory is simultaneously an allegory about tonality. So Eastman's music plays on a relation between the racial, the tonal, and the spiritual, and that's continually refigured in his music. And you know, as the music goes on, all of the ecstatic intensity drops away. It starts subtracting. It starts diminishing. It becomes more pointillist. And Eastman created a particular kind of notation to describe and to map this kind of arc. And there is a particular kind of tonal challenge that he sets. And you know, when you compare his work to Steve Reich or to Philip Glass or to John Adams or to Meredith Monk, it's clear that Eastman is maybe not necessarily a minimalist at all. You know, that's what people called him because the term minimalism has a prestige. So in a way, people thought they were elevating Eastman by calling him a minimalist. But what if he isn't at all? You know, you might call him a maximalist. You know, there were different terms, but I think of him as a certain kind of ecstatic music. In a way, I think of it as a new sacred music. I think that's Eastman was trying to elevate what he called black forces. And that was his term, black forces, which is a certain kind of spiritual and energetic impulse. And they were being manifested in this movement between the racial, the tonal, and the spiritual. And that's continually playing out from the moon silent modulation that Anjalika quoted right through to the end of his life in 1990, where at the end of his life, he's writing works like Hail Mary and Buddha. So then the kind of the pan spiritualist impulse in his music takes form. So I think those are some of the things at stake. And when you listen to Unjust Malaise, that becomes clear that that's part of the project, to create a kind of a new music that enhances black forces, that charges them, and that invites people into them because they are already there inside of America. You know, in fact, America is nothing but, American music is a kind of continual negation and incorporation of black forces. Okay, there's lots more to say, but I'll stop there.
I was wondering whether you could talk, because yesterday in Ramon Amaro's talk, he ended with a kind of looking at abstraction in relation to questions of identity. So I was wondering if one or both of you could, I know it's something you've talked to me about in the past, so maybe one of you could reflect on that.
I think the question of abstraction relates very well to the project that we've embarked on with Annie. I think I'd like to relate this question of abstraction to the question of xenogenesis. Xenogenesis is a term formulated by the African-American science fiction writer Octavia Estelle Butler. It's the name for the trilogy of books that she wrote at the end of the 1980s. Dawn from 1987, Adulthood Rights from 1988 and Imago from 1989. So these are three novels which rethink the relation between humans and aliens. So Xenogenesis translates as, outside becoming, Xeno outside, Genesis becoming, or becoming outside, but you could also say alien becoming or becoming alien. So if you take these as a diagram of forces and processes, then the question of abstraction relates to this, because the question of abstraction relates to the necessity to undo the given image of what the human is, and to, in a way, to find a way to get in touch with that which is not human within the human, that which is inhuman within the human, whether you want to call that the drives. If you're a Freudian or a Lacanian, you could call that the drives, but Octavia Butler calls that the Xeno. So the Xeno is that which is outside the human but inside it. And of course, in kind of philosophical terms, the notion of the black, the Negro, is that which is outside the human. So the figure of the black person is that figure which opens the genre of the human. That's to say race. What is race? Race is a genre. This is Sylvia Wynter's notion. Race is a genre of the human in which the human continually generates that which is supposed to be outside the human, which then disturbs what we think of as the human. So it's this complex relation in which the question of race opens out onto the question of what it is to be human, what it is to be a being, and what it is to become human, and what it is to become a being. So the question of race and the question of human immediately opens out onto the questions of ontology and ontogenesis, between being and becoming. And the question of ontogenesis leads us to the question of xenogenesis. An abstraction is a vector, it's a line, it's a way of getting in touch with those forces which are there all the time, but need to be summoned, invoked, nurtured, and cared for. So in a way, it requires a practice to become outside, or to open to the outside that is already you. There is a practice that's required, and the sonic practices are as good as any other.
I think you could also apply the idea of a practice to kind of the Advaita Yoga Sutra kind of philosophy around, consciousness and all of that, but that's a whole other thing. I think of generative alienation and the practice of generative alienation as also a kind of practice of mutation, or a practice of becoming mutants, which happens, where does it happen? And I think when one begins to realize that the inner city is, a place like London, which was where Kodwo and I are both born, where one could have time to think and become mutant and practice being alienated as such. You realize that this gives birth to an aesthetic. This gives birth to a series of refusals. You can find a way to protect your refusal through creating a practice. When you begin to realize that one's socialization, one's political socialization, one's ontology is completely under threat now, where it starts with Windrush. They've revoked the citizenship of this young woman. Will they revoke our citizenship? These are scary, upsetting, depressing times. I would never have imagined this would happen in the UK, where, we might lose our citizenship. Or, I can't even bear to think about it, but, where this threat exists, which is, you know, this awful Sadiq Khan is kind of like, you know, propagating. So you begin to realize that this this history of diasporic aesthetics are being actually eroded. In some cases, and you know, Britain, places like, I mean, every place has them, but I would say in the UK there was a definite exposure of those practices on television, in literature and in music, not so much in art necessarily in the you know, in the 70s or, you know, 60s, but or the 80s, they began with the Black Arts movement. These movements began to be kind of documented, I suppose, and presented. But, you know, certainly one begins to realize that you know, your history is being destroyed, and because Kodwo and I have always been very interested and always felt that we needed to, this idea of passing on. Dante, again, we had this conversation recently about how does queer black presence get passed on? How does queer black culture get passed on? Because there's no children, or he said we don't give birth to children, so, you know, I mean, he said that. But so there's this sense that, you know, this is a history that could die. How does it get passed on? You know, and Kodwo and I have been very determined in our work as curators to present the work of other artists. You know, because there is a sense that also, like in the 80s and in the 90s, there was a huge amount of support, or let's say there was a lobby for support, public funding for black art movements. That's all been taken away, more or less. So
we're running out of time, but okay. I did want to fit in a last question to Annie. As a as someone who works in museums, in a way, this morning is called Setting the Record Straight. So I was just wondering, since we have you here, if you could give us also a response to that in terms of what's the responsibility and role of the museum, what's the challenge, what can a museum do? Big question, I know, but a quick...
Well, it's amazing. One of the things I feel really happy about is as I'm leaving the museum that I'm accompanied by these two amazing artists in the last show I'm doing there, and that show is going to come to Emma. And I feel like all of the questions that they're bringing to the table are completely vital to us understanding the potential, again, of the museum space, beyond its classic modernist, violent, strident sort of position as a kind of epistemological gatekeeper, and as we said, a kind of a very white institution, and one that absolutely excluded many others. So I think it's all of that potential. And we've had a really great conversation about the idea of the exhibition as a trap, as a set of expectations and behaviors, and how one can play with that. So I think the potential of the museum is to understand all of those structures and to think, what now, what next? So it's a very propositional project, and I really do mean that. I feel like I will take the lessons from Xenogenesis very much on to the next museum, because I think it does exactly what Eastman is doing, exactly what we're talking about, understanding the terms and the nature of the call to order and the fight ahead.
Good to hear. We're going to move on now to Emma. I'm going to say a big thank you to all three of you. And